My name is Damian Gillis, and I'm a documentary filmmaker and media producer, and I'm coming to you from my home in Campbell River in Liquidnet territory on Vancouver Island. Just a few personal words here. In my background, I covered some of these issues for a number of years. I worked with the late former Environment Minister and broadcaster Rafe Mair. We covered some of the early days of the private power industry in British Columbia. I made a documentary film with Knowledge Network and CBC called Fractured Land, which looked at the nascent fracking industry and the plans for the LNG industry and also the related Site C dam project. And I have a personal interest in that subject as my family hails from the Peace Valley, and we lost our ranch at Gold Bar Ranch in 1968 for the flooding of the Williston Reservoir. And I've had family that lost property to Site C Dam. I think that my family at that time understood that they were making a sacrifice for the public interest of building a public power utility to benefit all British Columbians. And one of the questions I have today is that still true? And I'm also interested in some of the alternatives to this public utility that has been the focus of a lot of our energy in British Columbia. And we're going to hear from some esteemed experts here today in all of these topics. And it's been a while since I've been immersed in this, so I'm really here to learn, as is our audience today. A few words about our host before we get into introducing our panelists. The Canada West Forum Society is a volunteer organization dedicated to delivering reliable information from people who have gained expertise through study and experience. Many of us still believe that credentialed experts play a key role in helping us understand the world around us. The Canada West Forum exists to present voices of informed people to the public. Today, we have a panel of experts who bring different perspectives on the challenges of delivering clean energy in British Columbia. Glen Clark needs little introduction. After 13 years in the BC legislature, including 3.5 as premier, he joined the Jim Pattison Group, one of the province's largest private employers. Glen was promoted to president in 2011 and retired with the additional title of CEO at the end of 2022. He now serves as board chair of BC Hydro, and he tells me that he's at his 1-year anniversary mark with that organization. So we'll hopefully hear a bit of a state of the union of BC Hydro from him today and where it's headed from here. Jay Mather holds several leadership roles advancing renewable energy and clean tech projects. His work spans British Columbia, Europe, and the United Kingdom, helping shape sustainability initiatives in both government and the private sector. Jay served for years as the executive director of the Clean Energy Association of British Columbia and has worked with 15 First Nations to develop and maintain renewable energy projects. He is also an advisory board member of Simon Fraser University's Clean Energy Research Group. Markham Hislop is widely regarded as Western Canada's leading energy journalist. Through his energy media organization, he has reported on every major development in clean energy technology over the past decade. Markham's work focuses on the transition to a carbon-free economy, a subject that often attracts debate and criticism from those who would prefer a different pace or direction for that transition. We will begin by asking Glen Clark to discuss the direction of BC Hydro may follow in the coming years to ensure that British Columbians continue to enjoy reliable and affordable electricity. Jay Mather will then outline practical approaches for expanding the carbon-free electricity generation and integrating innovative technologies into our energy systems. And finally, Markham Hislop will explore a paradox in Canadian energy policy. While governments speak frequently about decarbonization, billions of dollars are still being invested in expanding fossil fuel production. And before I introduce the former Premier Clark, I just want to hold up this picture. The last time I spoke face to face with you, this was in 1998. So this is about 28 years ago or so.
My
and
goodness.
It's good to see you again today,
You-
sir.
I look, I keep looking and say, who's that old guy in the camera there? Man, but you look great.
Well, thank you, and it's been all downhill from there for me. But I'm very honored to have you here again today.
Thanks very much, Damien. You want me to start?
Yes,
Sure.
please.
Well, first of all, I'm neither esteemed nor an expert, so I don't qualify on either one, but I'm happy to be here today. Um, BC Hydro, it's a very exciting time at BC Hydro, most in a long time. If you think about it, BC Hydro was created by government in order to dam two river systems at the same time that the private sector would refuse to do because it was building in advance of need. And that period from the 1960s to the mid 1970s, particularly, was a massive period of building. Actually, by today's standards, just astonishing what those engineers accomplished. And of course, we live on that legacy today, and that's why we have one of the lowest power rates in the world. Actually, if you really think about it, the three lowest electricity cost jurisdictions in North America, and really amongst the three lowest cost electricity jurisdictions in the world, is Quebec, Manitoba, and British Columbia. And what do they have in common? They all have hydropower, and they all are owned by the crown. Um, what happened, of course, in the late 1970s and the 80s, particularly, BC Hydro turned from being a dynamic builder of energy resources to basically an operating company. Thousands of people were laid off and became kind of a boring utility company, with the exceptions of government intervention requiring private power. So, I mean, a lot of the run of the river projects, all really directed by government, very expensive projects at the time, and still are expensive in many cases. But they basically went to this operating utility. What's happened now, and certainly in the last year, is BC Hydro now is embarking upon another big expansion, in some cases ahead of need, because the government policy is really to electrify and decarbonize British Columbia. So, we're about 98%, 99%, depending on how you look at it, renewable energy in British Columbia. We want to try to stay that way or go 100% if we can at some point. And so we're now entering a massive building stage. In fact, I'd say two things. One is we have a big growth agenda, but we also have what I would call a sustaining capital agenda. If you think about BC Hydro and everything being built in the 60s, a lot of its physical stock is 60 years old. So even though it's been very well maintained by an excellent, really operating company here at BC Hydro, a lot of our stuff, if you will, is becoming end of life. So there's a big attempt to replenish and also to modernize the grid in order to take on more of the renewables. In addition to that, and this is the foresight of the people in the 60s, I think, when you look around British Columbia and you look at, say, Metrotown and Brentwood and these massive towers and all millions more people here, most of the substations in British Columbia did not need much expansion at all. In other words, they were built to accommodate this growth that we've seen in the last little while. And we've now reached the end of the ability to expand our electrification, if you will, with the existing infrastructure. So everything needs rebuilt, really, and enhanced. And we need to make sure, hopefully, that we're building to accommodate the next 20 years. Each substation in British Columbia, a new one, is about $1 billion. And we have 5 in our capital plan just for the next little while. We'll need more than that. So the capital plan for British Columbia will be probably about 50 billion, maybe 60 billion over the next 10 years. And that's really just to accommodate both the North Coast transmission line and this modernization of the grid and the ability to further the government's agenda, which is a clean energy agenda. So really exciting time. I think around here, we've got a new CEO. We've got almost all new VPs. We've got a real enthusiasm and a real effort to try to bring back that kind of pioneering spirit in British Columbia so we can, at BC Hydro, so that we can build the next phase of the big projects in British Columbia. And the next ones will be somewhat challenging, to be honest. I mean, starting with 10 new wind projects. Never seen a wind project in British Columbia, so there's some issues around. That's a slight exaggeration, but issues around bringing on that volume of interruptible power that has to be accommodated by BC Hydro. We're in a good position to do it. I'm not worried about it, but these are kind of new things. And we got a second call for power, which is mostly wind as well. So we got lots coming up. On the energy side, relatively easy to expand energy production in British Columbia. harder to provide energy capacity, which is another issue, which maybe we'll get into later. So anyway, that's enough for me. We got hydro's really a fun place to be these days.
Mm. Okay, thank you very much, Glenn. And we're just neglected to mention a little bit about our format today. So we're going to hand it off to Jay in a moment to make some introductory comments, and then Markham. Our audience is encouraged to submit questions to Gary, who's running, who's going to take some questions and pass them along to our panelists through the chat in Zoom here, and we'll have some. Prior to that, so you've got some time to do that. We'll have some roundtable discussion amongst our panelists, and I'll moderate that. So we'll now proceed with Jay.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I've been sort of in the clean tech innovation space for 30 odd years. As I like to say, I'm part of the old guard when it used to be called Eco Enterprise before it was called clean tech. And I was fortunate enough to have moved abroad, which I think is very, very important for this conversation. I spent 20 years in Europe, and when I left to go to Europe in the late 90s, it was because there was very little opportunities here in Canada for someone in the clean tech and in the sustainability space. Went to Europe, lots of opportunities. Realized that we were about 10, 15 years behind in BC and in Canada than the Europeans. Spent 20 years over there, moved back, and we're still 10, 15 years behind. And that is sort of one of the key principles that I want to talk about today, is that we have a not invented here issue in Canada, which is a massive challenge. And we tend to resist innovation from outside, but we don't have that luxury any longer. And necessity is the mother of invention. Everything to do with electricity and transmission and distribution is related to innovation at its core now, because we're in a new world of change that is radically accelerating every year. No load growth parameters that have ever been assessed in anywhere in the world have properly taken into account data centers or AI, none of them. And they change the entire game by themselves. When you look at electrification on its whole, too, this is transport, heating in buildings, and industry. We have a need for a grid in most places in the world, including BC, that is 2 or 3 times the size of its current capacity, and not in 2100, in 2035. So there's this big misstep between the methods and the ways that grid providers like BC Hydro and others have been using historically to assess load growth and demand, which has nothing to do with the reality. And so this new world order means it's time for innovation, whether people like it or not. And I will stress the AI and data center piece of this puzzle is the biggest bugbear in the room. And just as an example of that, BC Hydro is planning 300 megawatts in new data centers by 2030. TELUS is planning 400 megawatts in new data centers by 2027 in BC. Totally at odds with each other, and that's just one company. I personally am aware of 87 data center projects in British Columbia that are in development. Like this is a good example of how, if you've used spreadsheets and Excel to plan your data and to plan your capacity requirements, they're no longer fit for purpose. So this is a time of change. Luckily, myself, I run the European Union Low Carbon Business Action Project, the company I'm working with at Climate Door, which means I get to help European clean tech innovators bring their products and services to Canada. I'm paid by the EU to bring innovation to Canada. I get to play with cool bells and whistles. I mean, there are so many cool bells and whistles. The challenge is that I have to keep most of those innovations away from big companies in Canada, like BC Hydro, because of the 25 meeting, 7 years of talks, which kill SME innovators. They can't survive on that. They need traction. And so what we need to do is try and find a way to navigate that gap. And necessity is the time now. And what is fun here is the people who are the innovators are most often the tiny people. 90% of all innovation that happens in the world of technology occurs at the small to medium-sized business. This is a 1 to 500 person organization. And 90% of that is at the 1 to 5 person organization. Therefore, 81% of all innovation in existence comes from micro organizations. That's where the effort has to be focused. That's where the answers lie for the most part. That's where the new solutions are already being developed, are already available, are already proven.
Thank you very much, Jay. And we're going to hand it off to Markham to make some introductory remarks before we get into some further discussion. Oh, I think your mic might be muted there, Markham.
I was trying to be polite. I should know better than that. Uh, Thank you very much. I want to thank Norm and his organization for inviting me to sit on the panel. Really appreciate that. A little bit of background on Energy Media. You may not be aware of us. This is our 18th year, and I'm a journalist. My wife, Joanne, is my partner in the business. She comes from the TV side, does our editing, video and audio editing. We've been at this for a long time, and we our journalism model is based on expert interviews. So expertise is very important. We interview a lot of economists, engineers, analysts, so on. I've interviewed Jay a few times. Hi, Jay. So the half of our interviews with experts occur outside of North America or outside of Canada. So they would be primarily in the US, Europe, and Asia. And I can tell you that when you get outside Canada, the conversation around the energy transition is completely different, completely different. And I will say, and Jay mentioned this, and I want to expand on it a bit. There is a very large gap between what we say and what we do in Canada. And this is just as true in BC. We talk about how committed to the environment we are, how committed we are to emissions reductions. We don't do it. Our progress is very limited. Outside, and particularly this is true in Asia and to a lesser extent in Europe, they are the electric technologies on both the supply side, so it'd be wind and solar and renewables and hydro and what have you. But the real revolution is on the demand side. And that's something that Jay mentioned, and I want to drive that home. We made electricity for 125 years. We know how to do that. And we can scale electricity. We can scale power grids. That's a challenge, but we know how to do that. What we've never been able to do is to substitute devices that turn energy into work and make them electric. Internal combustion engines. We had electric cars 125 years ago. They ran on lead acid batteries. They weren't economic. We've had electric furnaces. We've had heat resistance furnaces. Can't compete with natural gas. We've had, electric industrial processes. Can't compete with other forms of energy. Now they can. Since 2020, many of those devices have crossed the S-curve, past the inflection point, and they are now the cost-effective, competitive option almost around the world. Now, of course, that depends on geography and region, and there's lots of caveats here. But nevertheless, the general principle in the energy transition is that electric technology is now outcompetes combustion technology. And that is something that BC has not wrapped its head around. This talk about, and I hope we're going to talk about LNG because I want to stake my flag on this. There will not be another LNG plant built in BC, not a one. Not maybe siliciums. That's it. And there's not a number of reasons for that. We can get into that in the discussion. But we need to stop chasing hydrocarbons and start focusing on electrotech on the demand side and renewable energy tied to hydro, which is a fantastic competitive advantage compared to other regions. And that is where we have to go. And I have some things that I'll be saying about BC Hydro's integrated resource plan, which in my opinion is not very ambitious and not up to task. And I'll be looking forward to Glen's comments on that. We'll maybe have a little discussion. So thank you, Damien.
Thank you, Markham. Let's dive in right there on this LNG and the nexus between our public power utility, which is largely hydropower related, and this fossil fuel economy. There were a lot of shifting explanations that were given at the time. Site C Dam was on the books since 1980. I know because I had family that owned land there, and they were under the shadow of when is this going to be flooded. It came and it went over the years, and we heard a number of different justifications for that power, like it would power 500,000 homes in BC. At the time, our electrical demand was pretty stable at around 50,000 gigawatt hours a year. And then we heard this all coincided with the big promise of $100 billion LNG industry in BC from former Premier Christy Clark, and that we were going to need this power to provide green or relatively to help make this very energy intensive process of cooling natural gas into a compressed state to put it on tankers and send it halfway around the world, that we could do that with a greener energy. And it was actually couched as the cleanest fossil fuel on the planet. That was how it was being. I spoke to people at the time at Cornell University who were doing the leading research on the real climate impacts of fracking and fugitive methane emissions, and indicated that it was actually the opposite of that it was very dirty. And then when you were taking additional energy to turn it into LNG, that just made it even worse. So here we are, and I know if Kitimat LNG were phase 2 were to go ahead, that would add, I believe, another 500 megawatts of requirement, which would be half of Site C's production. If we were to scale up and have multiple additional LNG plants, it would far exceed our capacity to power that through hydropower. We're building the Northwest Coast transmission line that Glenn mentioned, of which the intention of that is partly to provide electricity to LNG plants or mines and other heavy industry in Northwest BC. So my question really, and I'll put this to Glenn first, but to our other panelists, what role should our supposedly clean public power utility be playing in subsidizing the creation of fossil fuels? And is that undermining the whole intention of that utility? And when there's been so much sacrifice from the people that gave up their land, from First Nations, from the impacts on the environment to build these dams, does it make sense for that power to go now to get downcycled into the production of fossil fuels when, we hear that it's going to be needed for other aspects of our electrified economy? We'll start with the former premier, and then we'll hear from the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Damien. Well, first of all, it's not my job to defend the government's policy when it comes to LNG. So,
of course,
but I do want to be clear. BC Hydro legislation from the 1960s and continues to this day is we have a legal obligation to provide power to anybody that comes to British Columbia. Anybody. As soon as they want to turn on the power, it has to be here. So that's the job of BC Hydro. And there's only 2 exceptions to that, and they're recent, right? One is cryptocurrency, which we don't do anymore. And the second one is, of course, an allocation system for the pacing of AI data centers. And so those are the only restrictions. So anybody that comes and wants to start a mine in British Columbia, then we have an obligation to provide power. They have an obligation to connect it to our power system, but we have the obligation to provide the power. And that's been true, as long as I've been alive. And so we do have a fair amount of demand. In the north, there are big demands on those mines. I mean, one of the challenges for BC Hydro, and this is a relatively new challenge, is hydro, as all big monopoly utilities, have been working at a certain pace and a certain planning structure. It takes a long time, with maybe 15 years to build a dam, for example, or years of discussion and debate. And of course, things are moving much faster than they ever have for 2 reasons. One is clearly government's policy to desire and people's desire and the economics of decarbonizing the economy. So there's generally, obviously, a growth to electrification that we haven't seen before. And the secondly, of course, is these mines and other developments that government wants to pursue, and LNG, which require power. And so we're in a position of having to try to provide that power and provide it as clean as we possibly can. And the government, of course, also wants us to get off hydrofuels entirely. So that's our agenda. The largest consumer of electricity in British Columbia today is Highland Valley Copper. It's about 150 megawatts annually of consumed power. The second largest, I believe, is LNG 1, which is, I think, 120 megawatts. And remember, that's not the power of the compressors. That's all being done by natural gas. This is just the pumps and the lights and the control systems. So it's a big consumer of power. You're quite correct. I would be surprised if LNG 2 doesn't happen. Mark's made this comment. He might be right that, I don't know about the market, but the economics are such that it makes sense to expand an existing facility rather than a greenfield one. The same was true of wood fiber here in Lower Mainland. I'd be surprised if they didn't look to expand. I'd be surprised if cedar doesn't look to expand. And then there's silisms, right? Which is still, I think, somewhat of a debate, right? It's still in the early stages. So there are big ones. And the question would be, I guess, for BC Hydro is, do we provide all of the power, or like LNG 1, do we provide the power that's other than that's generated to produce the cooling for the gas? And those are still, I guess, debates. But we're trying to be in a position at Hydro to accommodate whatever is required, whatever people want. And I'm not particularly worried about energy, but I do worry a little bit about capacity, if you will, the peaking periods that we require. So those are the bigger challenges that we have. We do have, Jay, just because I have the floor here, but I do want to say that we have the biggest conservation program in history of BC Hydro, which we'll be launching fairly shortly, because of all the new cool technology associated with virtual grids and virtual power plants. And we think there's a big opportunity on the conservation side, and the cheapest opportunity for BC Hydro. And so we will be in a pretty aggressive, well, not pretty, but very aggressively pursuing that in BC, because we're counting on it actually to provide power. And the best part of it is it's more flexible power, if you will, than building a big giant, dam or a big gas plant or something. These are incremental opportunities that we have in British Columbia that we haven't exploited really well enough, in my view.
Agreed.
Thanks, Glenn. Before we hand off to Markham and Jay on this subject, I just wanted to circle back on one point you made, and I believe that a viewer chimed in a little bit about this too, which is, okay, we have a charter responsibility, BC Hydro, to provide power to these companies with a few exceptions. What is the requirement to subsidize that? When you talk about the Northwest Coast transmission line, for example, if the public is paying for that hookup infrastructure, or a big portion of that, should not more of that burden go to the end user? And when it comes to, say, the actual rates, and we used to have a policy where we have charged a lower rate to industry because we wanted to create jobs at mines and pulp mills and other things like that. This is a reasonable policy discussion for the province, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
No, it's a reasonable discussion, Damien, but I do think the reason we have a crown, the reason we have a government corporation, is to provide power, and we provide a postage stamp power rate to everybody. And I really think that's important. I mean, if you look at all the pulp mills in British Columbia, they all provided power from the public grid, right, from the system.
Yeah.
Every single project was Highland Valley Copper, the Trail Smelter, any of these projects all were given power by. That's the advantage of having a publicly owned utility. So is there cross subsidization? For sure, there is. And does it continue to this day? Absolutely. So anybody that comes here in British Columbia to invest in BC gets advantage of the low cost power. Our job at Hydro, and the biggest challenge in many respects, is affordability, right? Keeping the affordability matrix, if you will, because obviously the new incremental power, including wind power, anything we do that's incremental, not counting conservation, anything we do that's incremental is more expensive than our embedded average costs from those big hydro dams. So it's true that as we build out more wind, more solar, anything we do, batteries, everything, all of that stuff increases our marginal costs and therefore increases our average costs a little bit over the whole period. So that's the system we have in BC. It's worked well for British Columbians for many, many years, and I think it should in the future. But there's no doubt that those power costs are lower than they would be in other jurisdictions and for anybody that comes to BC.
Mm. Markham, thank you. And I realize that you're not making policy here as the chair of Hydro. You're not the premier anymore. So I grant you that for sure. Markham, would like you to chime in a little. You already kind of alluded a little bit to your sort of projections around LNG, and you have some thoughts on that. So while we're on the topic, I'll hand it to you, and then I'd love to hear from Jay as well.
Yes, I'm happy to provide data actually, and this is one of the things that is very often absent from these kinds of discussions is what do our customers want? What do customers in India and China and the rest of Asia or in Europe, what do they want? What are they willing to pay? That's the focus of the kind of work that I do. And I interview people like Mike Fullwood from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, or Anne-Sophie Corbeau from Columbia University, or the International Energy Agency. And here's what I've been told, is that last year there was 585 billion cubic meters of LNG sold in the world. That's the trade, out of a 710 billion cubic meters of liquefaction capacity. Between now and 2028, maybe 2029, the world is in the process of adding 300 billion cubic meters more liquefaction capacity. The supply is going to increase by 50%, and most of it will be from low-cost producers like Qatar. Now, the U.S. also, but they're not a low-cost producer. Nevertheless, the International Energy Agency in its 2025 World Energy Outlook said, we have a surplus of 185 billion cubic meters a year. We don't know where it's going to go. Where are the customers for that? So their modeling shows that there is a glut of LNG out in the global market out into the 2040s. And so Mike Fullwood said, and this is a guy who's got 40 years experience in the business, works for Oxford, so he's no slouch. And he said, there is BC's LNG is at the upper end of the cost curve. It is in around $9 to $9.50 an MBTU. You cannot compete in Asia on those prices. For instance, I interviewed an Indian economist. We talked about what it would cost to get gas into the Indian power sector. It would be $5.50 an MBTU. There is no chance that BC LNG can compete. Take a look at China, the biggest LNG importer in the world. Demand dropped 12% last year. And not only that, but the Chinese government entered into an MOU with the Russian government for the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, which in total, because it includes a couple of small side deals, is 62 BCM per year. 62. That's like 10% of the total global demand that would be delivered from Russia to China at very cheap prices. So I've been in this business a long time, and we're in our 18th year, and also I should add, I spent a lot of time in Alberta. I talked to Albertans in the oil and gas industry, and nobody ever talks about customers. And they don't understand, there's a fundamental misunderstanding in Canada, is that we keep thinking that energy is oil, gas, and coal. And it's not. Oil in particular has a new competitor. It's called electricity, because of all those devices that I talked about in my opening remarks. This is fundamentally changing the demand side of the economy. And that is where we have to go. We have to electrify in order to drive down our costs and increase our competitiveness. We have to electrify because we need to reduce the emissions intensity of our products, because China has just introduced a economy-wide industrial emitters carbon tax. The EU already has one, and it has a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Those are spreading around the world, those type of carbon pricing systems. So my point here is that we should, and Glenn, I'm sorry I'm going to be picking on you a lot in this panel. You talked about, you did what Canadians always do. You talked about supply. We don't talk about demand. And demand, supply is nothing without demand.
But Markham, these are private companies investing billions of dollars. They have offtake agreements. If they don't have offtake agreements, they wouldn't invest the money.
Where's the FID? Shy looks
Oh,
at
they
that,
haven't
doesn't
got.
have an FID.
Okay, so no, I grant you we haven't got any. But if they do expand LNG2, it will be because they have offtake agreements from somebody. Somebody's going to buy that power. Your point is a good one. So why do we care?
But you're making decisions, and there are lots of people, including the prime minister. The prime minister, who in a speech in Terrace said that he wanted to see Canadian, and in other words, BC LNG capacity increased by 500% by 2035, on the assumption that those private companies will enter into FIDs for the projects that are already on the books in BC. And I'm saying the evidence suggests that there will never be FIDs for those plants.
Mhm.
Let's keep on this demand topic here. And Jay, you brought up what is a really hot topic today, obviously, which is AI and data centers and what that is going to do to our demand. We did hear from Chairman Clark here that
Oh, I like
crypto
that sound of that. I like the sound of
Chairman
that.
Glen.
that crypto and AI, that there are some exemptions within the charter of hydro, if I understood that correctly, around not necessarily being able to or being required to provide that power. There's a big debate around this. We see it in America, places like Virginia and Arizona, where we're seeing a lot of people affected in communities where there was promises of jobs, which is often something that people will go along with a big impact project if they think it's going to, bring back their town. But we're seeing that once they're built, they don't require very many employees to run them, and then they're left with a lot of noise, pollution, light pollution, water depletion in Arizona, things like this. So, does BC, do we need to be part of the a data center rush here, or can we avoid it even if we wanted to? How does that play into the demand issue? And then feel free to chime in on other present day demands on our electrical system in terms of transitioning to more electrification in our economy.
Oh, where to start? Whew. What I would say is that there's a very simple truth that not many in our human race understand. The entire future of every economy on the planet Earth is ultimately down to electrons. Ultimately, when you go to the very end of the game, if you look at the economy of 2030, 2040, 2050, most of it is about electrons, and those electrons are mostly being used for data. And this is something that people think is an option. It's not an option. AI is already upending the fabric of our existence. Now, you want to get into philosophy? Should we do this? Probably not. This is the smartest, stupidest things humans have ever done, is AI. Easily the cleverest, dumb thing we've ever done. The implications of this are potentially society ending. We don't know what we're doing, and the people in charge, as we can see from Tech Bros, are largely made up of the worst humans in our species. So that's not good. But we're doing it anyway. We are. It's too late. A friend of mine who's an AI expert had a beautiful summary of this. I keep asking why. Why are we doing this? And he said, okay, just imagine the Stone Age turns into the Bronze Age, turns into the Iron Age, turns into the Steam Age, turns into the Atomic Age, and then the Information Age. Now, each one of those ages was a natural step in human evolution. The Atomic Age was the first one where we could have wiped ourselves out. We still could. But that's the first one where that age leap creates a new circumstance that could risk the entire civilization. AI is the next one. And if we didn't have the Dark Ages in Europe, maybe we would have been here in the 1700s instead of now. Maybe if we had another Dark Age or another massive pandemic that took out the population, we would have been here in 2100 or 2200. But this sort of seems like it's a natural step, and it doesn't matter what we do. So people's opinions on AI are irrelevant. Government's opinions are irrelevant, totally irrelevant, because we're either going to be a player or we're going to be, as Carney said, a meal on the table. That's it. And so BC, with this insane massive opportunity for clean energy development, we've harvested 0.000001% of our wind, and throw 7 more zeros on that when you look at how much we've done with solar. Throw 20 more zeros on that if you want to think about what we've done with geo generation of heat from, geothermal electricity generation. We've done nothing here, nothing. The wind projects in BC, I have to say this, they are a joke. They are a joke. Denmark produces what, 1,000 times more wind energy than all of Canada, and it's the size of Vancouver Island. I mean, we're so far behind. It's shocking. Anyway, the point here, trying to pull it back down to earth, is that how we view the world needs to change. And how we think about the future needs to change. And if BC Hydro doesn't build out capacity for AI, private industries are going to do it behind the fence. They're not going to wait. They're not going to listen. They're just going to do it themselves. If we want to decarbonize this province, what we should be doing is decarbonizing our entire gas transmission grid, because it's powered by gas compressors that burn gas to keep the pressure up. Each one of those compressors is where we have leaks, which, Damien, as you mentioned, when you look at LNG, you look at natural gas, the biggest impact is the fugitive carbon emissions from leaking. So that's what you do. You electrify the entire compressor system across the entire natural gas system that already exists. That's where we decarbonize. Fastest, cheapest, easiest place to put our electrons. Now, LNG, completely agree with Markham. There's no future. Not at all. Whatever's locked in now may happen. The ones that are talked about aren't going to happen. They don't make any sense. But what does make sense is us using our electrons for mining and value adding. It's taking our resources and turning them into something valuable, something so anti-Canadian, which is to value add. My God, a 1950s economic concept. Stop ripping stuff out of the ground and selling it to people. Never do that. Sell them the things they use it for. We should be doing that with our timber, our minerals, our electrons, everything. And so what I'm excited about here is the vast potential of this province to be at the spearhead of what's coming. Or we can sit back and talk about it like we do as Canadians forever and watch everyone run by us. That's the choice.
Well, let's talk about the future here, and I'd like to hear from Glen. You touched briefly on AI before, but you've heard from our fellow panelists here. What do you think about hydro's role in powering data centers, and what does that look like for BC? And can we take advantage of these exemptions potentially to say we're not going to bear that responsibility? Where does hydro stand on this?
First of all, we have quite a few data centers in British Columbia. Jay's right. This is a growth industry. It's happening, and we have lots, including some. There's a building down here which is hilarious, like an office building, which is a data center. And they're pretty big consumers of power. Part of the challenge, I think, is these hyperscalers versus the smaller data centers. So the hyperscalers it's not very many of them. It's basically Microsoft, Google, the usual suspects, and they're big, giant data centers. And that's what you're seeing in the US. Almost all natural gas driven generation, some hydro, some, like Bonneville's doing some. And we certainly will be looking at some of those. But the hyperscalers, I'm not as convinced that the economics are great for BC. So what we're mostly concentrating on is Canadian data centers. And we've, of course, got a tender document out right now, so we're going to see what comes forward. There is a lot of smoke. Let me be careful how I say this, but there's a lot of smoke around data centers a lot of hype, a lot of smoke, a lot of hype. So the auction that we're doing now for the first tranche of power will be really interesting to see when the smoke clears. There's some because the volume of data center applications might be high, but we'll see what the quality is like. And I don't want to be negative. There's lots of really interesting data centers opportunities, AI data center opportunities here in British Columbia. We're going to see a lot of them, but it'll be interesting to see how it actually unfolds. Some of the by the way, I do agree that there's more jobs than I think people realize on the data center side. First of all, the downstream benefits, obviously, of tech companies using data centers is hard to quantify, but it's real. And secondly, the NVIDIA comes out with a new chip now every 18 months. And it looks like that timeline was 24 months, 18 months, looks like it'll be 12 months. And each new chip is dramatically more powerful and uses more energy and uses more water. And so some of the data centers here in BC today, which might be 10 megawatts, not tiny, they're having to invest hundreds of millions of dollars constantly to keep up with the changing nature of the business. And that's might be challenging for that company, but it's certainly terrific for jobs and for reinvention. So there is lots of opportunities, and the cogen opportunities with the heat. You're starting to see more of those. Bell has a proposal in Kamloops, for example, with the district heating system. Creative Energy here in Vancouver, which has district heating, is trying to develop a data center here. But they are tough on the system because, not to bore everybody, but on a distribution network, you can't really do a 50 megawatt data center on the distribution. You have to have a transmission access, and so the smaller data centers using distribution utilities, if you will, like in the city of Vancouver, you can do those a little easier than the bigger ones that need transmission access, and the cost of the access to transmission is significant. Lastly, just on data centers, just so people remember, these things have to pretty well, there's some exceptions, have to run 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And so all of them that are coming in the door have a big diesel or gas-fired generator next to them because they're worried about, they need redundancy. They can't shut off. So hydropower might power them, but they have these backup facilities, which are quite large, actually. It's surprising to me. But they look like many of them are saying to us, well, we can't do it with interruptible power at all. And so these are firm base load, which are quite much more challenging in some respects. So I think you're going to see in BC some dramatic increases in data centers and AI sort of enabling things. I think that's great. I don't think there's any problem with that. We're just trying to pace it out so it doesn't explode the rate base as we're seeing in the United States with dramatic increases.
Let's stay on what it's going to take to power that here. And I want to kind of move into some of the options that Hydro is looking at, including wind and these power calls that you're tendering out. And I want to hear from Jay and Markham about what meeting these demands looks like, and also some of the conservation and demand side things that we can do to keep a lid on exploding demand. Maybe we'll carry on with Glenn here just briefly in terms of what do those new power sources look like that BC Hydro is exploring right now, and then I want to hear from the other panelists.
Well, someone made the point, was Jay, that the wind opportunities still are decent in BC, although our wind is not kind of world class in the piece. Mostly it's in the piece. It's about 30% world class. I think people would say it's 50%. And the only place we really have world-class power would be off the coast, Haida Gwaii and elsewhere. But the cost of that and the cost of transmission is so dramatically higher than our embedded costs, they become more challenging. But the ones in the Peace Country with 30% roughly, wind power are not bad in terms of economics. They're roughly double our embedded costs, but at the margin they're not bad. And so we have 10, and then there's more coming. And then BC Hydro is exploring also a directly owned wind resource, which is interesting. The wind is nice with Hydro because Hydro has that flexibility and the storage capability. So wind is a really nice, dovetails nicely with Hydro resources. The only thing I'd say,
because we have these big dams that are like batteries, essentially,
yes,
that you can
100%.
Base load backstop. Yeah.
Yes. Now, I would say it depends how much wind you get, because we're starting to use up the more wind you have, the more you need the flexibility of BC Hydro. And so that's not a problem at all. I think someone said, I mean, we got lots of opportunity for wind, but at some point it becomes problematic for we give away, if you will, or we use up our flexibility, the more interruptible power we add to the grid. And so that's a slight worry. You may know, we make about $600 million a year in exporting power to the United States, buying power, mostly cheap solar power from the US, selling it back to them, shaping it, using our hydro resources to do that. So our electricity trade, which has been very lucrative and is about, last time I looked, about a 17% rate reduction in British Columbia because of our export of electricity. That becomes more challenging if you start using up that flexibility on our own wind projects. So that's not a problem for today or tomorrow. But down the road, that's the things you got to look at. How do we manage that big battery? And of course, that's why I'm so keen on some of the new technology on the distributed side, because I think if we can, the more we can supplement or reduce our consumer demand by new technology, the more we can retain that flexibility that we have in our big hydro system. But there's lots of opportunities. The firm power is more worrisome for me, because basically you've got dams, you've got geothermal, which is underdeveloped in British Columbia. You've got batteries. Solar is not really competitive in British Columbia, given the rates and the cost. We're doing some solar where we're trying to get off diesel power, but it's not. It's really, it keeps improving. So really, hopefully, it'll get there. But right now, the cost for British Columbia on solar is just doesn't really make much sense. Neither does our sun here particularly good. In fact, Hydro has a map they showed me of the solar regions, and there's only one part of all of North America that's sort of gray, and that's British Columbia. So we have less opportunity on the solar side than some other places in Canada. More opportunity on the wind side, less opportunity on the solar side. Batteries are a big part of it. We're in our current plan, we have 2 big battery installations going in. One will be in Vancouver Island, one will be in the Lower Mainland. And batteries are, I think, a big part of the future as costs come down. Costs have come down quite dramatically in the last year because of China mostly, but they come down because of use. But they still only store 4 hours, and so they're not quite a full solution unless you get array of them. And again, the costs are quite dramatically higher. So that's the only issue I think that I worry about is the firm power opportunities for British Columbia. That's an area where right now we have two small gas plants that we still use, and we're trying to get off of, and they're still pretty important for our system.
Markham, I want to hear from both of you guys. Or go ahead, Jay. If you got a hot topic, I want to make sure we come back to Markham in a second. You go. Go ahead.
Sorry, Markham. You have a million things to add to.
Jump in there. I just know we haven't heard from him in a bit. So yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. What I would say is solar is totally cost competitive in BC, and also too is wind. There's a thing called levelized cost of energy, LCOE, how much it costs to make a kilowatt, right? Now, to make a kilowatt of electricity from the solar panel currently at utility scale, in the rest of the world, not BC, in the rest of the world is around 3 cents per kilowatt hour. Mm-hmm. Wind is around 4 cents per kilowatt hour. Now,
except in BC.
There's a reason for that, which I'm going to go into.
Yeah.
If you add a battery that gives you 4 hours of capacity, you've now added 2 cents a kilowatt hour to that. If you want 8 hours of capacity, you've added 3.5 cents. If you want to have 12 hours, you've added 4.5 cents. So now we're starting to understand the numbers, which is what Markham was talking about. Right. So 3 cents per kilowatt hour for solar. If you want 8 hours of batteries, now it's 7.5 cents. Okay. Now, you're right, that doesn't compete with legacy hydro, which is down at the 4 cents per kilowatt, but that's because it was built in the 1960s and paid off. If you built a brand new dam, Site C, 15 cents per kilowatt hour is what it costs to build Site C. So solar and wind kill Site C. Kill it, even with giant batteries already today. Now, let's try to tie this together as we look holistically. The reason why electricity is so expensive with new power in BC is because of BC Hydro's coal for power model. because everything is so risked on the call for power project that every single incumbent who puts in a bid has to add 5 or 10 cents a kilowatt hour to each kilowatt because of all of the risk that's forloaded onto them by BC Hydro that makes it expensive. So if we want cheap power, we have to redesign the entire way calls for power are designed because that's where the risk sits. Because guess what? This power is being delivered everywhere else in the world at the prices I just said. In
So you
BC,
want
it's
hydro? You
15.
want hydro to take the risk and the private sector to get the benefit?
No, I'd like Hydro to actually cut and paste global best practice.
Mhm.
That's
I,
it.
I have
That's
a
it.
whole
That's
different
it.
theory on that, but I will come back to that in a second. But Markham, I want to hand it to you for a moment.
I'm going to shift the conversation just a little bit here. And the reason for that is about 5 years ago, I interviewed a fellow named Val Jensen, who was a vice president of a utility in Illinois. And he said something to me that stuck. He said, Markham, do not ever let utilities lead a process. Utilities are by their nature run by engineers and accountants, and they're very, very conservative. Their job is to keep the lights on. So when you flick that switch, the lights come on. That's it. They are not leaders, they're not innovators, they are not out at the front of the pack. Okay, so that's one thing. So I'm going to let actually Glenn off the hook a little bit here. I have a problem with the integrated resource plan. I think it's too conservative. The load demand forecasts are too low, et cetera, et cetera. But he's not the leader. The BC Hydro is not the leader. The provincial government is the shareholder of BC Hydro. And so here's another little experiment I did. I sent requests to the media representatives of the Ministry of Energy in Victoria, Adrian Dix, and the one in Natural Resources Canada in Ottawa. So Minister Tim Hodgson, we don't need to know, we don't have to discuss Alberta. We know exactly where they're coming from. And I asked the question, which energy demand modeling studies inform your minister's decision-making and his public comments on energy issues? And the responses were identical. OPEC, the International Energy Agency's STEP scenario, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the Japanese Institute for Economics, Shell, ExxonMobil. My point here is the governments that are making the decisions in this country are not informed by Ember Energy. They're not informed by the International Energy Agency's APS scenario. They're informed by the conservative hydrocarbon and fossil fuel oriented modeling. And I've been through that modeling. It's my hobby. I like to read energy demand modeling. And I've compared the assumptions that are in those modeling studies to the data and the trends that we're currently seeing. And in my opinion, the most likely scenario is the APS scenario, which shows a decline of oil demand by about 50% by 2050 and a very large demand drop in gas consumption by 2050. So here's the problem. Glenn and his organization are not getting adequate direction from the provincial government because they are still rooted in old world thinking, in 20th century thinking. We essentially have, for the most part in this country, including in BC, we have a 20th century energy model that cannot grapple with a 21st century energy transition and an energy system. That is it's an intellectual problem before it's anything. And I think that some of much of what Jay said is reflected in that observation. So what Glenn says is great. You know, we have to have some more power. We're going to do some mining. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. We're going to put some batteries by transformers out in your yard. All of that is good stuff. That's not the key issue we should be talking about in this forum. It should be these bigger policy issues, intellectual issues. What's going on at the global level? What's going on with the technology and the costs, and where are our customers? That's the conversation that really matters here, not the conversation, frankly, that we're having.
So in 90 seconds or less, what is your solution to this giant shift that you're talking about here, Mark? And what should we be doing at the provincial level here in terms of planning for this future? How should we be reorienting things?
Well, one of the things is, I mean, Jay said it, copy and paste. There are plenty of countries who are out in front of us and in front of BC in terms of how to do this. Industrial policy tied to electrification, demand side policies, all of that kind of thing. But the biggest thing, my biggest complaint here is the lack of effort we have put into the analyzing the data around electrification, particularly on the demand side. Point me to one economist in Canada, just one, who has done any kind of analysis, modeling or otherwise, that says, here's what's going on at the global level, here's the change, here's the pace, here are the technologies, and these are the implications for Canada. You cannot find one because I've looked. The closest is Dr. Chris Bataille out of Vancouver, who works for Columbia University. Nobody talks to him. His customers are all overseas and then down in the United States. Our own homegrown folks who understand policy, who understand the data, understand the trends, and the prophet can't get recognition in his own hometown. It's an old problem. We have an intellectual problem before we have any other technical or policy problem.
I don't agree, Markham, not surprisingly. First of all, just so you know, the demand side that we do in BC Hydro, it's nothing to do with the government. The government listens to BC Hydro, not the other way around in terms of direction. They don't give us direction. Well,
what did I say? What did I say?
But we build demand. Mm-hmm. We have a very sophisticated demand management model that looks at demand. Now, our job, I'd rather overbuild than underbuild. But look, these, it's not hard to decarbonize. Like triple the price of gas, triple, you can do it. The question is social justice, equity. The question is our affordability. We are doing frigging fantastic in British Columbia. You guys are so negative. This is fantastic. We have the lowest electricity rates in the friggin' world with a publicly owned system. And we have tremendous opportunity to add capacity and add energy at relative low costs. We're like, why? Like, I mean, the private sector wants to invest. We provide the electricity, and we're in such
Glenn, thank you very much.
spot.
Thank you very much for illustrating my point about a 20th century energy model that you're trying to impose on.
What do you want to do? You want us to build? You want us to way overbuild because it's coming? Because you think it's coming?
And again,
Is that what you think?
you are focusing on supply. What we should be doing, okay, I'll give you an example. How much trucking do we have? What kind of a logistics industry do we have in BC where trucks are run on diesel? Already in China, we know 50% of the Class 8 semi-trucks last year were electric because they've got the cost down. It is a lower cost per kilometer traveled in an electric truck than it is in a diesel truck. You want to have a competitive economy, you need to get your transportation cost down. That's just one example. You want to be competitive in industrial processes. You need heat pumps, industrial heat pumps. Now, your job at BC Hydro is to plan how to get the electricity there. And you do a wonderful job in that. I'm not arguing that point. I'm arguing that it's the technologies that are not being adopted at scale or manufactured at scale in British Columbia, and that's an economic issue and it's a policy issue. It's not your issue.
Absolutely true.
When it comes to transportation, there's a lot of things we could be doing, and one of the things is we focused a lot on electric vehicles, but we're still doing single occupant vehicle kind of model, building more highways, expanding the highway infrastructure as opposed to public transit, for example. Now we're doing some of that, but we've spent a lot more money on highway conventional single occupant vehicle type modeling, and maybe trucks, that's harder to do. But we could, rather than relying on a whole bunch of more Priuses that are going to require a massive amount of electricity, maybe we could be expanding our public transit and looking into how we design our urban design in the Lower Mainland and population centers to reduce demand on transportation. So I can see that there, and also one commenter mentioned, like, I took advantage of the Canada Greener Homes Energy Program to put solar panels on my roof. And I'm in a grid tie situation with hydro, and my power bills are a third what they used to be because I still need a little bit in the winter. But like we can localize solar to individual homeowners, where people are taking a stake in that and they own their own mini power production system, and that could be quite efficient. And we could be doing more to subsidize that. So I mean,
It's
there are
already done.
in the
It's already done
yeah,
throughout the world. That's the funny
yeah,
thing is we're still talking about this like it's an option, like
It's
it's
done
a
here.
nice to
Okay, it's still
have.
done here. We subsidize
It's
it here
not it's not done here. The amount of solar panels on roofs in Vancouver
because
is
it's
the back
cheap,
of a
because it's expensive.
well, that is a factor, but the reality is that yes, that is a factor. But the reality is the payback period for a 5 kilowatt solar system on the roof of a house in Vancouver, if we
It's
had
15 years.
even equal price point on, you get the same power value that
yeah,
you send into the grid that you charge it back for. You level
yeah.
those two
The
things
grid
off
time.
because
Yeah,
they've been changed radically lower because of BC Hydro through the BCUC a few years ago. The amount you got paid dropped through the floor intentionally to stop people from putting solar panels on their roofs because it was made to make it more expensive. The point here is that we could easily have sub 8 year payback periods for an average solar system on an average roof with an equivalency. That's not hard. That's good value for money. The reality of all this is that if you want to talk about transport, the most important thing to electrify is small vans, the 1.5 tons and smaller. They transport 78% of all the goods and services in British Columbia. And the average small van truck does less than 100 kilometers of range a day. That's where you electrify. And it's funny because that's data driven. Okay, this is the place we should be throwing giant incentives. This is the place we should be hitting marks, right? And we don't do that very often. We tend to do this broad base. And, ultimately, transmission and distribution, by the way, the whole rest of the planet has separated from generation. The European Union in 1999 made it
Yeah.
illegal for grid companies to run transmission, distribution, and
Thank God
generation.
we didn't do that in British Columbia. Thank God.
Well, it depends.
We actually have a publicly owned
mm,
system in British Columbia that's providing terrific service to people.
I,
And
I
all
get
these
it,
conservatives, they
but
all want to break it up, market it, and everything else. Thank
yeah,
God
but
we
it's
didn't do
holding
that.
us, back now because
From
the
what?
reality
From
is
what? Holding us back from
because
what?
okay, I'll give you an example. A one
Sure.
megawatt solar project in central British Columbia was the last one delivered under the IPP. Okay, now that was a First Nation run project, a 1 megawatt. This is not a
Right.
big system. It was on a transmission line that had a 4.5 megawatt loss between A and B. It sat in the middle. Now, that connection everywhere on the planet would cost $50,000 to plug in, except BC Hydro charged 400 grand to plug a megawatt in to upgrade the grid connection, which was totally unnecessary because of hyper conservative approaches from engineers who were scared and didn't know what to do. And you had to teach all these BC Hydro engineers how to work with solar integration because they'd never done it before in that section. My point here is that made the price of that power skyrocket because of ineptness and inadequacy on the grid connection process. So if you don't manage grid connection properly, then you're going to kill cost effectiveness. If you don't manage your call for power process with risk management properly on global best practice, you're going to kill the cost effectiveness of a project. And this is the thing. We do have a huge amount of potential. And you're right, Glenn, you nailed it. The best wind in BC is actually between Haida Gwaii and northern Vancouver Island. That is amongst the windiest places in the world. Now, a wind turbine, a large scale wind turbine, needs around 30%. 30% of the hours in the year it's generating power reasonably. Now, that section of BC's coast, 70% of the hours of the year would it be generating. And you know what we need to be doing there is building gigantic multi-gigawatt wind farms with a high voltage grid connection down into Vancouver so that we can benefit from that cheap power. And that's
It's
the
not
got
point.
cheap
about
if you have to.
yeah.
Joe,
It
it's not
is.
cheap if you have to build all that.
It
It's not
is.
cheap. It's
No, my point.
expensive.
Okay, now, Glenn, I work in tech. I'm the guy who brings the innovation here. I
Yeah,
know
yeah.
what it costs, and let me explain to you. It would be sub 3 cents a kilowatt with a
Oh, come
grid
on!
connection
Not
with a
with
high
we have
voltage
to
power line.
high voltage cables underwater. It's expensive
Yes,
power.
yes. Okay, guess what? 3.5 cents a kilowatt. You want a couple of batteries? four
Get
cents a
out of here!
kilowatt.
It's expensive power.
I want to
Listen,
end
so
on. I want to end. We
this
we
is
got
for
about 5 minutes. We
misinformed.
got 5 minutes left here, but we had landed into a
Well,
topic that I want to cover. We're going to do this really briefly here. The idea of, and this is something I've covered for years, is who owns this and these power calls. Okay, you talked about risk here, Jay, to the private sector. I also take the view that historically, BC Hydro built and owned these assets, and I've seen where we committed to a 40-year contract to a private power developer. They took that to a big bank and got the project financed because they had a guaranteed customer, and we paid for it, and we guaranteed we'd pay for it for 40 years, but we didn't own it at the end of the day. And I am a
Yeah.
fan of the public utility owning things because it's public. It's a public asset. And it has a legacy, and we see the benefits of those legacies and the sacrifices that my grandparents and great grandparents made for giving up that land to build the Bennett Dam. That we're still benefiting from that over the years. So I want to end on this idea of like, where does hydro? What's the future here? And how much should we be owning this publicly and versus offloading risk, if that's even what it is, to the private sector here? And we got like a minute each here, and then we're going to wrap up.
Well, as Jay pointed out, we're not really offloading risk. Well, we are, but we're it's super conservative in that regard. I agree. Look, I agree with you, Damien. I mean, I would prefer to see more public ownership of these large assets leased. The advantage that the private sector has is there's a couple of advantages. If you want to deploy quickly a bunch of small power projects, private sector is probably easier to do that. Less drag on the system. You have to borrow the money. But the big projects, the big dams, any big geothermal or anything like that, particularly, absolutely should be owned by BC Hydro. And I think so should probably it should be a large wind opportunity that's BC Hydro. If we ever did something offshore, Jay's correct. If we did that, and we will do that someday, it should be owned by BC Hydro, in my view, partly because the costs are so much cheaper. And the North Coast transmission line is effectively privatized by the government with First Nations, and that has increased the cost. We shouldn't hide about that. These are private power requires a rate of return on their capital. BC Hydro builds with debt only, and so the cost is significantly higher for any private project relative to BC Hydro. But there are some advantages of having the innovation, and the smaller innovation and smaller companies can move quickly and gear up quickly. I think that's the only probably real advantage. The run-of-the-river projects, they always sound like they're small environmental projects. These are massive projects that really were really expensive and still remain expensive. As they come up for renewal, we're obviously driving the price down because the system is paid. These things are paid for from the first round, and there's some opportunities there, I think, for BC Hydro. So on balance, we're mostly a public system, but we have increasingly privatized part of the generation. And frankly, I think you're right, Damien. We should be looking more at large scale, publicly owned assets, which long term will be cheaper for BC.
Markham, a minute here, and then over to you, Jay, and we'll wrap this up.
I agree with BC Hydro. I actually, despite what I've said today, I actually like BC Hydro. I'm a Manitoba Hydro boy from way back in the day. That being said, I will say that the trend in global electricity markets is to distributed energy resources and to innovation. Mm-hmm. And if BC Hydro can figure out a way to incorporate all that innovative technology, all that innovation and things, like the fact that, like, Glenn, you should not get your hands on closed loop geothermal ever. Ever. But that you can put a closed loop geothermal unit right next to a data center at $65 a megawatt hour. Stuff like that. There is so much innovation going on in this space, and we are not, Glenn's comments notwithstanding about what hydro is doing, there's much more to be had. And I think that's what Jay's getting at. And that's where I think we need to go. And the government, BC government, has got to get off its ass, get involved in energy policy, and provide more direction to Glenn and his crew than they currently are.
Jay,
The
Jay,
tail's wagging the
Just
dog.
thank you, Markham. Jay, 1 minute here, and I'll just make a few final comments, and we'll be done. Thank you.
Okay, two main things. One, I'd say on the comment that Glenn made about ownership, and I think what we should be looking at here to get the best of both worlds is a hybrid, where there is a shared ownership, shared risk. So we've got the utility who thinks about the long term and the ratepayer and the value, and you've got the innovators who do the real work on innovation. I think that hybrid is really worth exploring. The other one I want to quickly drive us back to is data centers. There are technologies available right now, and right now spearheading the largest data center project in Canada with this innovation that uses zero water, which uses 90% less electricity, that is 20 times the density, and also is 1/8 the maintenance. We've got new bells and whistles here. This isn't always a Model T. There are technologies right now that have the ability to do data center crunching at micro level at a few hundred kilowatts baked into a highly efficient building. You don't even notice it, and you use it to heat and cool the building. This is the point, is we got to be careful about making these hasty generalizations about that's expensive or that's how this works or this is how cars work. No, none of that matters. What matters is what is the art of the real potential now, and how could we redesign BC Hydro so there's a bunch of executives that get gigantic bonuses for taking risks and putting innovation in instead of getting slapped because it doesn't work. That model kills innovation. So there has to be an incentive package designed at some executive level in BC Hydro that says, well done, you tried something, and even if it didn't work. And that requires rethinking the entire bureaucracy. That's all.
Thank you. I'm just going to chime in, we didn't get a chance to cover everybody's questions here. I was doing my best to read the chat, but I will just give voice to one other thought here, circle back, which is that I think a number of people commented on wanting to have more support for homeowners in this kind of, and small businesses and buildings, commercial buildings, to be able to integrate renewable energy into their facilities, to be able to incentivize homeowners to do solar at a fair cost, because that's something that we can all partake in providing our own energy needs throughout the province. So that's something that hopefully we continue to see some more development of those incentives provincially, federally, through BC Hydro, and I can see that that's something that customers want. And I think we're just going to wrap it up here. I want to say a big thank you to our panelists. I think we got into some great discussion. Clearly, we could spend many hours more debating the future, but I think we got into some solutions here. This is not an easy topic, and we're going to have to keep working on it. But I also want to say a big thank you to the Canada West Forum, Norm Farrell and the whole team there for convening this group of excellent speakers and making this discussion possible. Thank you to our audience, and we'll see you for the next discussion soon. Thank you.